Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. Have you seen the news about Canon's release of the new flagship camera, the R1? Well, I've had my hands on it for the last month and shot 33,000 shots with it, including leading a photo safari trip to Botswana, and I'm going to share my views on this camera. What's the autofocus like? How's the rolling shutter? Low light performance? How is the pre-capture feature that takes photos before you hit the shutter? And is 24 megapixels enough? And what really matters, did I get some nice photos with it? All that and more tested out in the field in real life, coming up. If you stay till the end, I'll share 5 unique quirks that will help you if you're considering owning this camera. My name is Simon d'Entremont and I'm a Canon Ambassador, as well as a professional wildlife and nature photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. One of the great perks of being a Canon Ambassador is that they give you toys to play with. Canon sent me this R1 several weeks back and I've been putting it through its paces. So let's look at this camera in more detail and how it performed for me. Note that this is a pre-production model, so my results may not be what a final production model may give you. Let's go over the specs very quickly. The Canon R1 comes with a 24 megapixel sensor that's both backside illuminated and stacked. This allows for faster readout speeds, which we'll see later are important in implementing usable electronic shutters. The Canon technical people tell me that this electronic shutter is as good as the mechanical shutter was in the Canon 1DX Mark III. This camera can do in-camera upscaling on JPEGs and do noise reduction in camera as well, and has a smarter autofocus system allowing it not just to focus on things, but track things through the frame, kind of like knowing what things are and what you want to focus on. This is accomplished in part by moving from vertical phase detection in previous cameras to now having cross-type phase detection across the whole sensor. It of course has the bigger battery of many professional bodies, and I don't think I ever got the battery under 50% in an outing, even if I shoot 3,000 shots. A quick tip, turn on airplane mode to save some battery power in the field. So what are my first impressions? The feel in the hand is great, and I'll tell you, after doing photography a lot, the more important this becomes in me enjoying a camera. I need to enjoy using it. It feels lighter than it looks. And the EVF is a monster. 9.4 million dots and 0.9 times magnification and 3 times brighter than the R3 EVF and blackout free. It's like a whole television in there. Other features are the battery grip for vertical shooting and with all the buttons you need in the right place and customizable button, tons of them. 2 slots for CF Express cards and of course, great weather sealing. But now let's look at performance in the field under real world conditions. Most of my comparisons will be with the original R5, as that's where my experience lies. I've shot the R3, but not enough to give definitive comparisons against the R1. Using the R1, I photographed peregrine falcons diving after sandpipers, taken it on a pelagic trip for offshore birds, shot hummingbirds, white-tailed deer, and finally off to Botswana for big cats, elephants, giraffes, and numerous other subjects. First, let's talk about the autofocus, maybe the most critical aspect of an action camera. The autofocus in this camera has been simplified from previous cameras. My Canon R5 has 4 autofocus cases or presets. My Canon 5D Mark IV had 6, way too many. Now they've simplified things with now having an auto mode and a manual option for you to tweak it. The beauty here is that the auto system is so good you really don't need many options here. I tried out this camera on various fast moving and challenging conditions. I shot peregrine falcons diving at flocks of thousands of sandpipers using my RF 600mm f4. The challenge was keeping the peregrine in the field of view during dives, not the camera tracking it. One situation that can often fool a camera autofocus system is backlighting. While I was in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, I love shooting these aquatic antelopes called red leshways as they run through shallow water, especially when backlit. The backlighting combined with water splashing can be a real challenge for an autofocus system. My R5 does a decent job at it, but will sometimes jump between the water and the subject or the background. Speaking of the autofocus system of my Canon R5, it sometimes gets stuck on the background, which is its biggest weakness, and won't come back close to focus on objects that are very close to you. That being said, in the Canon R1, this is much, much better, where the camera can quickly go from being focused at infinity to jumping to be in focus at something that jumped out right in front of me. A great, great improvement. The R1 was definitely a step above the R5 for focusing in backlit situations. Quick to acquire, super sticky, and can handle direction changes like a champ, like in this series where this antelope changed directions and flipped on a dime. That happens fast at 600 millimeters. Or this series of running right through the sunset, no problem. It was also easy to go from subject to subject like in the zebras. When you see a box with arrows next to it, it's letting you know that you can move to another subject. You just use the touch feature on the AF on back button, which I also have set to back button focus, and the focus point will move around as detected. Eye detection and subject detection was really solid for my time with it. If it couldn't find the eye, it would find the head or the body, no problem. Another important aspect for an action camera is the frame rate. For this one, the mechanical shutter is 12 frames per second, same as my R5. I actually like 12. When I shoot with the R5's electronic shutter at 20 frames, it's just too many. And there's no limit as far as I could tell. I think I could do 1,000 raw photos in a row on the R1. You can keep the shutter button down as long as you want without buffering for shooting long bursts. Now let's discuss the electronic shutter, maybe one of the R1's strengths. With my R5, the electronic shutter has two drawbacks. One, with the electronic shutter, my files go from 14-bit, like in the mechanical shutter mode, to 12-bit in electronic shutter mode. This means that the electronic shutter has compromises in terms of image quality. Secondly, with the R5 and its readout speed of 16 milliseconds means that you can have an artifact with fast-moving subjects called rolling shutter. Well, what better way to test this than with hummingbirds? So I set up both my R5 and R1 to shoot these hummingbirds, and here was the result. At the top and the bottom of the wing beat, even the R5 can freeze the action, as the wing slows down to change direction. But in the middle of a wing beat, you can see the distortion that occurs. In this shot, one wing is going one way and the second wing another. But with the R1's electronic shutter and a super quick 2.8 millisecond readout speed, even the middle of the wing beat is frozen. No distortion and no image quality impacts as far as I've seen. And in case you're thinking, I can see a bit of bending in that hummingbird wing, the electronic shutter in the R1 can go higher than what was traditionally the cap at 1/8,000th of a second with mechanical shutters. Here are some hummingbird shots at 1/16,000th of a second, ISO 10,000, and no noise reduction applied. The wings still have some bow to them, which I'm pretty sure is there in real life, so not caused by the rolling shutter. These look great to me. So what's the corollary to these results? It means that using the electronic shutter, including its benefits for silent shooting and higher frame rates, and which used to come with trade-offs in image quality and distortions, can now be used without compromise. A great result in fast action photography. By the way, the electronic shutter can also be programmed to have a sound with it, so you know it's being used. On my R5, it was silent and with only some screen flicker to know it was taking photos, and you could shoot 500 pics without even realizing you were doing it. Here it is with the sound on. Now let's talk about image stabilization, another standout in this camera. This is measured at 8.5 stops in the middle and 7.5 stops on the edges. One way I can really tell how good it is when shooting video handheld with my 600mm f4 lens. I really noticed a difference over the R5 and the R1 setup. I could handhold it much steadier and the footage just looked so much more stable, like here. I wish I could have had this on Zodiacs in Svalbard, where keeping it steady was a real pain. When looking at the IBIS as for photography, here's an example of shooting in almost dark conditions after sunset in Botswana on this black-backed jackal. With the lens handheld and using the electronic shutter to minimize shutter vibration, here's 1/40th of a second and ISO 8000. That's pretty darn good at 600mm. To note, the scene looked like this to the eye, but to get the best image quality, you're better off exposing the scene more brightly and darkening it in post, rather than exposing dark and trying to brighten it later. One feature that as a wildlife photographer I'm really looking forward to is pre-capture. When on, the camera is continuously recording 20 frames in a half-second loop, such that when you hit the shutter, it records the half-second prior to the shutter press in the form of 20 raw images using the electronic shutter. But now when would I want to use it? For wildlife, it's when action is likely to happen that reflexes aren't fast enough to capture the early stages of that sequence. In Botswana, I was able to catch a bee-eater in its nest and waited for it to fly before hitting the shutter. It went a half second back and fired off 20 frames, then continued shooting. A great feature. I also love these bee-eaters because they have a predictable behavior of jumping off a perch to catch an insect, then returning to the same perch. With pre-capture on, I was able to get the jump off the perch, and by staying focused on the perch, get its return too by hitting the shutter and grabbing a bunch of frames even before I saw the action happen in real time. Now, many people are talking about the 24 megapixels and whether or not it's enough. Here's my take on it. First, if you need more megapixels for deep cropping or 8K video, the R5 II is a great camera with many of the autofocus features of this camera and still has great weather sealing. Second, the low pass filter on this to prevent moire is way smarter than old ones and still holds on to lots of detail. That means that this 24 megapixels can punch above its weight in detail in my experience. And third, there are plenty of genres that will use a camera like this for which 24 megapixels is the sweet spot. Still lots of detail there. Wildlife photographers are always interested in noise and ISO performance because we shoot in low light very often. If we look at the noise and detail on this shot at 6400, it's still very good performance with no noise reduction applied. I intentionally got the ISO up on some shots with this camera just so you can get a look at the performance at higher ISOs. Here's some shots taken at ISO 6400, 8000, and 12800 with no noise reduction applied. If you're a hybrid shooter, let's look at the video features. This camera can shoot 422 10-bit, 420 10-bit, and 420 8-bit. The difference from past cameras is that these can be adjusted separately from various modes and resolutions. They used to be tied to certain other settings, but now you can change them at will. The R1 can shoot 6K RAW up to 60 frames per second, 4K up to 120 frames per second, and Full HD up to 240. It has C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 for those who like shooting in C-Log. I didn't use them all, but here's some footage shot at 422 10-bit, high frame rate enabled. It looks great to me. All of this was shot handheld with my RF 600mm f4 lens with no post-processing other than profiles applied in camera. Now some quick bonus tips. When I tried to move the diopter, I couldn't adjust it. I pushed as hard as I could without feeling I would break it. I finally figured it out. You need to pull out the diopter for it to turn like setting the time on a watch, and then you push it back in. When it comes to pre-capture, unfortunately there isn't a convenient toggle switch that can turn it on and off. It's presently enabled via the menus, which I find a bit cumbersome. I'd rather have it set to a button, which I've passed on to Canon. That being said, I have a workaround. I set my favorite settings on the camera, including the pre-capture on, and save it to the C1 custom button. That way, when I want to use it, I just put the camera on C1, you half press the shutter button, and it loads up pre-capture. And when you fully press the shutter, it saves the 20 pre-capture images and keeps firing after that. Another great addition for a Canon camera is having audio in the slow motion modes. Note though that to get this, you need to turn it into slow motion in post-processing. If you use the in-camera slow motion, which is enabled using the high frame rate options, you won't get the in-camera audio recording. This is still a nice feature though. The audio is 24-bit and 4-channel too, which is nice. The AF on button is now half pressable. This is a great feature that allows you to move focus points around or make selections, but not activate them until you do the full press. Very handy for moving focus points around the frame, but not enabling them until you're ready. As a back button focus user, this is super handy for me. This camera also has another neat feature. You can take stills while shooting video. The stills are 17 megabyte JPEGs that can only be used in the 1080 Full HD video mode with a 16:9 aspect ratio. Even with these caveats, I'm happy to see this implemented, and I'm sure in the future it'll keep being improved. If all this talk about autofocus systems and how to set them up on a Canon camera interests you, check out my video on that, which you can see right here. And if this video is deserving, please give it a like so YouTube will show it to even more photographers who are keen to learn more about the Canon R1. I hope you can use this information to make the right choice about what camera you want to buy, and hope that you can get out there soon to take your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.